practice at the University of Johannesburg and author of the recently published book titled Committee, Grassroots Democracy in South African Shack Settlements, and that was published just a few weeks ago by Pluto Press. So Comrade Trevor, on to you. You can unmute yourself and I'm going to give you 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fighter Terri. Thanks to everyone. Yeah, it's an honor to welcome everyone to this Neville Alexander Commemorative Conference on Racial Capitalism. In particular, I'd like to welcome Comrade Barbara Ransby, Andy Clarno, and Robin DG Kelley. So this is quite an important day for me personally, because we have this new center, the Center for Sociological Research and Practice, which I was appointed to direct in January. And then, so this event, which the Center for Education Rights and Transformation holds annually, Comrade Salim Vally and his team at CERT were kind enough to invite our new center, the CSRP, to be co-host. So it's very generous of them. And it is a comradely gesture that has given the CSRP team hope and strength in the challenging work ahead, because this new center, we're almost building it from scratch. So I'm also grateful to Comrade Robin DG Kelley for agreeing to join the advisory board of the center. His presence not only gives our center stature and gravitas, but as you can see in today's event, we're already benefiting from being exposed to his groundbreaking, exciting, and indeed revolutionary ideas. I would also like, with your permission, Comrade Chair, to take this opportunity of announcing the members of our full advisory board, the CSRP advisory board, because in fact, this is our first public event, which is why we are so grateful to CERT. So it is, of course, Comrade Robin Kelley, Comrade Mark Shabalala, the president of SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, Carl Klute, who is the retired Deputy General Secretary of NUMSA, Sherry Hamilton, socialist and practitioner of workers' education based at UJ, University of Johannesburg, Asanda Benya, gender and labor studies specialist based at UCT, Mokong Maparimeng, based at the Human Sciences Research Council, a decolonization researcher and theorist, Simpiano Gieza, who is head of development studies at the University of Zululand, Donna Andrews, feminist and social movement activist, independent scholar, and finally, Marcel van der Linden, a historian of social movements and labor at the University of Amsterdam. So if this was a football team, I would confidently say that this squad can take on and win among established teams. So thank you all for agreeing to be part of CSRP. Your guidance will give us direction. Finally, I'd like to thank a group of comrades who have been thinking through, discussing, and driving the establishment of our new center. And these are the chairperson of the day, Fighter Terri Maggott, Luke Sinwell, Claire Seruti, Mosa Phadi, who's on the platform, Mondi Hlachwayo, Salim Vally, Sam Ashman, Cleopatra Shezi, Spio Mbata, and Emmanuel Meni Ness. all the way from New York. So those are just thanking comrades who have made our center possible. So finally, I just want to make a brief comment on the politics related to this topic, racial capitalism. I think that there is an urgent need to re-theorize racial capitalism in South Africa, indeed in the USA and Palestine. A lot has changed since the early pioneering theories of racial capitalism. We all know that Marxism is not a dogma, it is a guide to action. It has to link theory with practice, ideas with reality. Now, the South African working class, I want to argue, needs to go beyond to outgrow the NDR. The characterization of the South African Revolution as a national democratic revolution is no longer applicable, if ever it was. And so is its strategy of revolution, the theory of two stages. We're in a crisis here. We are stuck in the first stage of capitalism. We're not moving anywhere. There is turmoil, but no center of authority. There is no workers' movement that is leading the struggle for socialism. And indeed, even when comrades, come together and are engaged in the process of regroupment of working class forces, for example, NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, SAFTU, our new federation, the SRWP, Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, and other groups and formations, there is a heavy hangover, ibabalazi, from the dead-end politics of the ANC and the SACP, the Communist Party. The same concepts are being used, even the songs are still the same. The Freedom Charter, racial nationalism, etc. Now, Marx wrote that men and women make their own history, but they don't do so in conditions of their own choosing. The tradition of all dead generations wears like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So, comrades, I talk about ipapalazi. I stopped drinking alcohol many years ago, but I remember, when my head was fuzzy and my body was painful the day after the party, the best medicine, the best cure was something small, something strong, something that makes your face twist, grimace. So I hope that today's discussions will provide that strong and sharp dose of Marxism and analysis that will cure us of the shibboleths, the dead-end ideas of yesterday. So welcome to everyone. I hope we have a good time discussing, sharing. Thank you very much. Amandla.
Thank you, Comrade Trevor. Thank you so much. Okay, so next on our program, we have Comrade Salim, who is going to introduce the program and say a few words. For those of you who don't know, Salim is the director of the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation at UJ, and he holds the NRF Saatchi Chair in Community, Adult and Workers Education. His latest co-edited book with Aziz Chowdhury is titled University and Social Justice, and that was published by Pluto Press in 2020. Comrade Salim, I'm giving you 10 minutes.
Thanks, Terri. That's more than enough time. And thanks, Comrade Trevor. This is really exciting. And greetings to all the presenters and the many people joining us on this and platform. Hopefully there will be other platforms as well. And I thought I'll just say a few words about the annual Neville Alexander Conference and the theme this year. After I give this few points, we'll have the two keynote speakers, Barbara and Robin, and then we'll have 10 minutes inputs from Mosa, Andy, as well as Andile. So Comrade Neville Alexander launched our center, the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation, in 2009 at UJ. And since his passing in 2012, in the wake of the Marikana massacre, the significance of which he really understood despite being in hospital already. Since 2012, we've held an annual conference linking really his praxis to ongoing current struggles. And so this year we decided to jointly host it with the newly established and still to be officially launched Center for Sociological Research and Practice, and Comrade Trevor Ngwane is the director. So, you know, many people concede that the phrase racial capitalism first emerged in the context of Southern African liberation struggles in the 70s, before its particular formulation by Cedric Robinson in his book, Black Marxism. And in South Africa, of course, Neville Alexander, together with Martin Lagasse, Bernard Magubane, and others, were early advocates of the term. And just a bit about Neville Alexander. He was born in Cradock in the Eastern Cape. He received his doctorate in Germany, and then, prompted by the Sharpeville massacre, Alexander, together with Namibian and South African activists, formed the National Liberation Front, NLF. And the members included the late Judge Fikile Bam and Dulcie September, who was later assassinated in Paris. She was the ANC representative there, as well as a number of others, such as people like Betty van der Hayden and Marcus Solomon. So at the time of his arrest in 1963, Alexander was a history teacher at Livingston High School. He was imprisoned on Robben Island for 10 years, followed by 5 years of house arrest. And for many, many years, Alexander grappled with questions of racism, class exploitation, caste, ethnicity, nation in South Africa. And all of this is evidenced in his book, One Azania, One Nation, The National Question in South Africa. It was written under the nom de guerre No Sizwe. Alexander clandestinely began writing the book on Robben Island and completed it during the period of his house arrest in Cape Town from 1974 to 1979. And really, he was motivated to start writing the book after a long and really celebrated debate with Madiba, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and others on Robben Island. In his own words, the discussion and debate took almost 2 years. We used to meet once a week and discuss. I need to say that Alexander formed very close friendships with all prisoners, despite their differing political views, whether they were members of the ANC, the PAC, and others. I mean, he was particularly close to Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela, Jafta Masemola, and Ahmed Kathrada. Fast forward, because of time, Alexander was a founding member of the National Forum in 1983, where over 200 organizations and some 800 delegates came together, most of whom were to the left of the ANC and largely belonged to socialist and Black consciousness organization. At the end of the conference, the delegates unanimously adopted the Manifesto of the Azanian People, and its opening sentence in part reads, "Our struggle for national liberation is directed at the system of racial capitalism." And, you know, Barbara, Andy, Robin will tell you that the term has now become ubiquitous in the US, particularly following the estimated 26 million people who took to the streets last year after the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and its severe impact on African American and Latinx workers also propelled the increasing use of the term. So for Robin Kelley, and I quote, "The boldest activists demanded that we shift the resources funding police and prisons to housing, universal healthcare, living wage jobs, universal basic income, green energy, and a system of restorative justice. These new abolitionists are not interested in making capitalism fairer, safer, and less racist. They know this is impossible. They want to bring an end to racial capitalism." So last few words about Alexander. He believed that it was impossible to wage a successful struggle without a theory. And so he remained committed to using the analytical tools of Marxism to develop this theory. His Marxism, of course, was not dogmatic. It was enriched by his deep understanding of the South African reality and his praxis and the reality with its complex combinations and intersections of color, class, gender. He was also an internationalist, and he followed the developments in North Africa and the Middle East closely, right up to the time of his passing. In his writings, Enver Motala and I show that Alexander avoided both class reductionist interpretations of social change and the essentialism of racist categorization. And underlying his approach was the idea of alternatives and demonstrable possibilities. And of course, we say that his was an approach that went beyond social critique and academic analysis, beyond the boundaries constructed by the requirements of the conventional scholarship. So, since for Alexander and many of us, engagement was inseparable from serious, rigorous scholarly activity. So finally, for Alexander, the resolution to racial capitalism is anti-racist socialism. And in post-apartheid South Africa, Comrade Alexander's analysis remains prescient. My time has really run out. Terri has been generous, so I'll just end by saying that the term increasingly has relevance for other contexts as well, besides the USA and South Africa, such as occupied Palestine. And Andy Clarno and Palestinians like Haider Eid have written some brilliant pieces, including for organizations like Al-Shabaka. And so it'll be really interesting to hear Andy speak about that. So I'll stop here, Terri. Thank you very much. And I really look forward to the discussion following all the inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you for that framing and for the introduction of the program. I see that Naeem has put two links in the chat. One is to Comrade Neville's book and another one is to the Azanian Manifesto. So people are welcome to follow those. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the juicy bits. We're going to have two keynote addresses, and I'll just introduce each speaker before they go. So let's start with Barbara Ransby. Barbara is Distinguished Professor in the Department of African American Studies, Gender and Women Studies, and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's the author of Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century, and other books. She was deeply involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and the Free South Africa movement in the 1980s. So Barbara, you can unmute yourself and you've got 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm so honored to be in this program. I want to thank Salim Vally and Andy Clarno for inviting me to be a part of the conversation, albeit virtually. And I assure you, I would much rather be with you in Joburg or Cape Town, wherever people are, rather than many, many miles away. But hopefully we will be in one another's presence before too long. And thanks to Trevor Ngwane for framing this gathering at the outset. As always, I am honored to be in the company of my dear brother and comrade, Robin DG Kelley. And quite frankly, I'm eager to get my remarks out of the way because I really want to hear the amazing panel that will follow. And truth be told, we're the warm-up act for the real center stage conversation that's coming. Parenthetically, I also want to say that I know that I'm in good company when in the course of 1 month, I have 2 academically based or university-based programs that I'm invited to that both have to be postponed because of solidarity with student and worker protests. So in addition to the uprising in South Africa, I was scheduled to be a part of the Beyond the Bars anti-prison conference at Columbia University in New York last week, and the grad student workers were on strike. So that had to be postponed. So I'm glad that we're finally getting together, and I'm glad that we're all coming together with our feet firmly planted in struggle. So I was asked to offer some remarks on the current Black freedom movement in the US and how the critique of capitalism, of racial capitalism, fits into it, flows through it, and informs it. In his wonderful book, Neoliberal Apartheid, Andy Clarno quotes the late Neville Alexander, in whose secular spirit we gather today, in describing the period after 1994 in South Africa with a blunt and for some inconvenient truth. Neville Alexander said, quote, in post-apartheid South Africa, what we used to call the apartheid capitalist system has simply given way to the post-apartheid capitalist system. Now, we in the US have a lot that we can draw from that quote. In the evolution of racial capitalism in the US, we have seen a slightly different but similar turn. In the post-de jure era, that is the post-Jim Crow era, we have seen an opening up of sorts. That is an opening up for some, emphasis on some. In the previous periods, there was a firewall that kept all Black people, regardless of class, out of certain positions of power, out of certain institutions, dominant media and cultural spaces. And all of that was lowered and relaxed after the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, not eliminated, but lowered. Now we have Black celebrities that make hundreds of millions of dollars. We have Black CEOs that run billion-dollar corporations. And we even had a Black head of state. But the Black poor and working class are still not free, and justice is still not ours. In a Black capitalist fantasy world, though, we have arrived, except there are these inconvenient truths. The inconvenient truth of the largest number of poor and working class people in prison than in any time in history. The inconvenient truth of police murders. The inconvenient truth of an utterly obscene wealth gap with billionaires like Jeff Bezos making over $1 trillion in profits during the last year alone, a year when so many people were facing housing and food insecurity. And of course, Bezos, by the way, is now fighting against a very heroic organizing effort by Amazon workers in Alabama. And the inconvenient truth that women continue to work more hours for less money and continue to be vulnerable to all forms of harassment and assault. This is the bad news about 21st century racial capitalism. But the good news is that social movements are, for the most part, not being duped by the new multiracial face of capital. Now I'm going to segue to talk a bit more specifically about the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives, and I'll talk a little bit about the distinction between the two. But let me also preface this section of my talk by saying a word or two about my relationship to this subject. In other words, how I situate myself relative to the work. I grew up in Detroit, a Midwestern industrial town in the 1960s and 70s. I was politicized by the Black liberation movement that was raging at that time, and later became involved with the larger left. I come from a family of tenant farmers, sharecroppers, maids, and factory workers. No one was middle class. They were hoping to make it solidly into the working class, hoping for union jobs and a little less precarity in their lives. So it's their lives and struggles and my childhood experiences that inform how I come to this work. I've been deeply involved for the past 40 years in some form or fashion with the Black freedom movement, the US left, Black feminist politics, and transnational solidarity work, including, as the introduction indicated, many years as an anti-apartheid student organizer in the US and as a steadfast supporter of the struggle of the Palestinian people. So that's a little bit about me. And I'd like to segue here to talk about M4BL, which I'm also involved in. M4BL is a movement for Black lives. Now, let me make a distinction here between the movement for Black lives and the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is a larger rubric, a slogan, a label, under which a lot of organized and unorganized protests have occurred. And it's kind of become ubiquitous. It began as a hashtag and it caught fire because it captured what so many of us felt, knew in our gut, and saw with our own eyes: the devaluation of Black life, particularly Black, poor, and working class lives. It eventually evolved in the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which now has dozens of chapters. But the movement for Black lives is something a bit different and something bigger. It is an organized coalition of over 100 Black-led organizations around the country that emerged as a big tent container for many of the forces that were in motion and that emerged out of the Black Lives Matter moment in 2014, including but not limited to various chapters of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. Organizations like the Dream Defenders in Florida, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the Black Youth Project 100, Southerners on New Ground, Freedom Inc., the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and many others. It's important to also note that many of the leaders of these organizations and the M4BL coalition as a whole are young, Black, queer organizers, overwhelmingly anti-capitalist, internationalist, and many of them from working class backgrounds. They are at the heart of this movement. They are not perfect. They have made mistakes. They are not always on the same page, but overall, I think they are on the right track. So with all of that as a kind of overview, I want to highlight several things that I think help to talk about the ways in which this movement has embraced an anti-capitalist analysis and how the class politics are reflected in the work of the movement. First of all, I think it's important to look at who the movement is fighting for. Some of my own scholarship has been on the mid-20th century Black freedom movement. And in that period, there was a real internal struggle around what would be the face of the movement. When the Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955, of course, many of the Southern ministers who helped to organize that were eager to put forward a respectable face of the movement. So Rosa Parks, even though we have a limited and distorted view of who she really was, but Rosa Parks was put forward as a kind of middle class, respectable face on the movement. Other folks who were deemed disreputable, i.e. working class folks who didn't conform to norms of middle class respectability, were pushed to the side. This movement has rejected those politics of respectability. They have looked to some of the most marginalized and oppressed sectors of our community. And when you look at some of the most high profile cases of the movement for Black lives struggles, people like Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Rukia Boyd, Walter Scott, Eric Garner, and many others, we see a profile of Black working class people who have been forced out of the formal economy, who have struggled in the informal economy. For example, Alton Sterling, who was killed in 2016 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, comes into contact with the cops how? He's selling CDs out of the trunk of his car. He's hustling. He's not able to make a living in the formal economy, at least not an adequate one. Philando Castile, who is killed in his car in the suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, is a school cafeteria worker with a high school education. The average wage for cafeteria workers in St. Paul is $10.50 an hour. Rukia Boyd, who's killed in Chicago in 2012, was socializing with a group of friends in the North Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago, one of the poorest in the city, where over half the people, overwhelmingly Black and brown, live below the poverty line. She is killed by an off-duty cop. Walter Scott in Charleston, South Carolina, is killed while he's running away after his car was stopped, his 15-year-old car, for a broken headlight, a broken tail light. He had been jailed 3 times for his failure to make child support payments. In other words, he was running away because he feared he'd be jailed for inability to pay a debt. And then there's the case of Eric Garner. Eric Garner, who is murdered in Staten Island, New York, was known to the police for selling loose cigarettes on a corner in Staten Island. He was a father of 4 and had not been able to find the kind of work that would help him support his family. At that time, his mother, Gwen Carr, who became active as a result of Eric's murder, wrote this. She said, when Eric Garner was, I'm quoting her, when Eric Garner was killed, he was selling cigarettes to support his family. These 2 things are, of course, connected. They reflect the ongoing struggle of the Black community every day for racial and economic justice. They are at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement. Eric's senseless death has forced our country to confront the toxic effects of police brutality. My hope is that together we can also change the system that trapped him and so many Black men and women across our country and nation in poverty. That was Eric Garner's mother, end quote. So in other words, the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement, by focusing on police violence, by focusing on the prison system and calling for abolition, they have focused on a racial issue, but also a class issue, because it is poor Black and working class people who've been the shock absorbers for late stage capitalism. The second point that I want to illustrate in terms of the class politics of the movement is when we ask, what is the movement fighting against? And who is the movement fighting against? Now, on the most obvious level, is fighting against racist state violence. But it is significant that now that we have a multiracial ruling elite and a multiracial governing elite, it is significant that the movement has not hesitated to confront local and national leaders, Black politicians, who have been in one way or another apologists for the system. It is further significant that the movement emerges in 2014 under the tenure of the country's first Black president. The young people in the movement for Black Lives understand clearly that representational politics were not a goal, and they were not duped by brown faces in high places. In fact, Jelani Cobb, a movement adjacent journalist, wrote, maybe we had to have a Black president to see the limits of a Black president. What they are demanding indeed is structural change. The police killing of 25-year-old Freddie Gray in Baltimore in 2015 illustrated this quite clearly. The DA was a Black woman, the mayor was a Black woman, and when Freddie Gray was murdered in police custody, the entire city exploded without hesitation, indicting the system of racial capitalism for what it had done to Freddie Gray, working class Black man in the city. And it didn't matter that there were Black officials in power. Pro-Black working class politics have been at the center of this project from the outset. And it is not simply an organic impulse. It is articulated and inscribed in the speeches, slogans, demands, and documents of the movement. And Robin has written about this, and I've written about this. The 2016 Vision for Black Lives document, which came out in the wake of Mike Brown's murder in Ferguson, was a document from the movement for Black Lives. And it covered a range of issues. It really was a manifesto for Black liberation, but also offered a broad-based left platform. addressing issues from reproductive justice to labor rights, healthcare, housing, education as a right, as well as an end to police violence. Various campaigns that the movement has been involved in echo this sentiment, from the Free Black Mamas Bailout campaign to the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, which is linking the call for economic justice with an end to racial injustice. The third thing I want to speak to in terms of navigating this question of racial capitalism as it impacts the current movement is the current terrain of struggle. It is a dangerous and precarious landscape, and a landscape in flux. We have seen, of course, in the last 4.5 years, the more visible growth of a white nationalist movement that is armed and dangerous. Organizations like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and their accomplices in the Republican Party. Trump is out of office now, but Trumpism continues. And what Trumpism offered was white nationalism as a strategy by the sector of the US ruling class to salvage racial capitalism, which is facing some very fundamental crises at this moment, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Again, that is the bad news. There's a proto-fascist movement afoot, and we have to defeat it and offer an alternative and build an alternative. But we do indeed have a growing progressive movement of which there is a strong radical core. The Bernie Sanders campaign in the last electoral cycle, with all of its contradictions, was an openly socialist campaign, and a lot of young Black people supported it, even if it was indeed critical support, and my support was critical as well. But I'm even more optimistic about the emergence of organizations like Left Roots, a people of color-led socialist formation that has a 2-year plan of deep study and struggle to see what kind of formation is possible in this period. And the more broad, but also anti-capitalist coalition, the Rising Majority, of which I'm a part, which involves over 70 Black, Indigenous, progressive, multiracial organizations and labor organizations in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. Excuse me. So I think I'm nearing the end of my time. I just wanted to lay out some general parameters of the movement. And some of these conclusions are drawn from my own practice, but also from my research on my book, Making All Black Lives Matter. And so let me end by leaning into optimism. And I will end by just reading you a short section from my book, which is the epilogue. And it really talks about the experience of interviewing, marching, struggling, debating with some of the leaders of this current iteration of the Black freedom movement. I struggled to complete this book while engaging in and supporting the ongoing resistance against a new proto-fascist turn in US politics, one in which racism, misogyny, and all varieties of xenophobia are alarmingly pronounced. In my efforts to make sense of an ever-changing national and global landscape, I hope this book makes some small contribution to the freedom-making work that lies ahead. If Alicia Garza's initial Facebook post in 2013 was a love letter to Black people, this epilogue is a love letter to the organizations in the movement for Black lives and a tribute to their increasingly expansive vision. First of all, thank you. Thank you for your courage and your passion, your savvy and your boldness. Thank you for facing the bloody reality embedded in the historical fibers of this country that have become all too routine, and saying no. And in saying no, you brazenly rejected the bourgeois trappings of respectability. In other words, you said hell no to state violence in its crudest form, as well as to the slow death that racial capitalism and its neoliberal practices have caused over time. Your practice reflects an understanding that only when elites cannot buy you off, dazzle you with their power, intoxicate you with a sense of your own importance, and tempt you with trinkets and access to money and celebrity, can you be truly engaged in a liberatory process of freedom making. For many of you, this time has come. When the amazing Chicago organizer Aislinn Pulley declined an invitation to the White House without blinking because she did not want to be part of a photo op with no outcome, we all felt a little bit freer. When Black brunch protesters strolled into fancy eateries and began to impolitely talk about Black death, breaking the bubble of denial that shrouds privilege, we knew we were a little bit freer. When you refused to be Al Sharpton's proteges or political accessories or human backdrop to his press conferences, we knew we were a little freer. When Bree Newsom climbed up a South Carolina flagpole and yanked that Confederate flag down, we felt a little freer. And when the respected Southern-based organizer Mary Hooks told us, as only she could, to pool our dollars, to use them as crowbars to pry open the steel cages and free our sisters from jail during the Black Mamas bailout campaign, we all felt a little freer. Acts of defiance, disruption, and insurgent rule breaking are the ways that we delink from the politics of routine, of acclamation, of compromise, of collaboration. To paraphrase James Baldwin, it is when we demand the impossible that we come closest to real freedom. What do I see when I look at this cohort of activists? I see the faces of 13-year-olds peering out from narrow windows at the Juvenile Detention Center to see hundreds of young activists marching through the chilly Chicago night, holding up signs saying, "We love you." I see you on ladders wrapped in chains, holding flags and banners. I see you daringly wading into rush hour traffic on major highways to force people to look at the reality of Black death, determined in the spirit of No Pasarán. I see Joss and Jasmine peering from behind cold steel bars, and I see Marshawn dead on the steps of the Ohio State House. I see you quietly crying at the back of the church during Alton Sterling's funeral and standing alongside Eric Garner's daughter, Tamir's mother, Rakia's brother. I see you in a hot, crowded little house in Havana, drinking beer and talking politics in 2 languages, in a dusty refugee camp near Ramallah, in a favela in Rio after meeting with the landless workers movement, comparing notes about displacement, and in a shanty town outside Joburg, trying to make sense of a revolution gone astray. Above all, I hear you insisting that this is a world family, and the struggle goes far beyond the borders that the colonizers have carved out in the earth. And even when we disagree, we are dancing the same dance. Finally, I see you building political altars, paying homage to the wisdom of grandmothers and grandfathers, knowing all the while that your eyes will witness and your hands will build a world they could only have imagined. When you chant, "We know we will win," in spiraling crescendo, I believe you. I believe you with hope and love and expectation, all wrapped around you in a fierce and unrelenting embrace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Comrade Barbara, for so clearly sketching out the US struggle against racial capitalism, and also for ending on such an inspiring internationalist note. Before we go on to Robin, I see that Amelia has shared a link to the Movement for Black Lives website. So thank you, Comrade Amelia. It's good to see you and so many other familiar faces here tonight. Okay, so let's move on to Robin DG Kelley. Robin is a professor of American history at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the author of numerous books, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz in Revolutionary Times. Robin is also on the board of the new Center for Sociological Research and Practice here at UJ. And Robin, I'm giving you 20 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. First, thank everyone who put this together. Thank you, Terry, Trevor, Salim, everyone involved with the Center for Sociological Research and Practice, which is a great assembly of just brilliance. And of course, the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation. It's always great to be here with my dear friend and mentor, Barbara Ransby, who's been teaching me for 30 years. And, you know, it's always hard to follow, although I'm like in tears in many ways, just thinking about, these are the folks that Barbara knows. I mean, when she talks about, with such intimacy, the organizers who have built this movement, she's been at this for a very long time. And I watch in awe as I try to follow her footsteps, but they're so big, I keep tripping and falling on my face. But, you know, it's just great to be here. And also, finally, before I begin, all the people in the audience who I know and love, who took care of me when I was in South Africa the last couple of times, the people who I owe an email or a text message to, who's been trying to reach me, like Asher, you know, and of course, it's good to see other people. In any case, let me just begin. I want to focus most of my remarks on some of the critical lessons we can take from Neville Alexander for understanding and advancing the struggle against racial capitalism. The US, Palestine, and certainly, I don't need to talk about South Africa, but that's another place. But before I do that, I kind of want to take a moment to respond to a very disturbing trend taking place in the US, which is the use, is to use the kind of discovery or rediscovery of Neville Alexander to attack Cedric Robinson. There's a kind of manufactured debate over who owns racial capitalism, who coined it first, and what is the lineage of the term, who deserves credit. And it's a debate that neither Alexander nor Robinson actually participated in. They were unaware of it, and they are both not with us right now. But it's being used in some ways to delegitimize Cedric Robinson's work by a certain group of people, while ironically avoiding a deeper engagement with Neville Alexander's full body of work, which is prodigious and crucially important and needs to be read in its entirety. So first I want to, you know, I know from experience that no one working on South Africa in the 80s, for example, you know, or working on the South African left, believed that Cedric Robinson coined the term racial capitalism. That it was circulating in South Africa was already common knowledge. Even those who may not have read Martin Legassick's and David Hempson's Foreign Investment in the Reproduction of Racial Capitalism in South Africa, which is really an essay in the form of a pamphlet. It came out in '76. Probably were aware of it. They might have read Ruth Milkman's review of it the following year. I know that when I was in graduate school, everyone was reading the review essay that Deborah Posel had written in Social Dynamics about kind of rethinking the race-class debate in South African historiography. I began graduate study in South African history at UCLA in 1983, where I was working on a dissertation about the South African Communist Party and the left more broadly. And I was also on the editorial board of Ufahamu, which was the graduate, still exists, the longest running graduate student-run journal in African studies. And there, as a member of the board, we published essays about South Africa that reference racial capitalism. And this is before I even knew who Cedric Robinson was. We had pieces by Hugh Byrne, Bernard Magubani, Horace Campbell, and my colleague, Alison Drew, who's a fellow grad student at UCLA and contributor to Ufahamu. She was working on a dissertation that was titled Social Mobilization and Racial Capitalism in South Africa, 1928 to 1960. And she went on to write a really amazing book about the South African left. And you know, we were all familiar with Neville Alexander, though back in those days, we actually didn't know that Nosizwe was Neville Alexander. We found it out later. But by 1983, racial capitalism had become standard nomenclature in studies of South African political economy, sometimes expressed differently, sometimes written out as racially structured capitalism. But the point is, and the point I just want to make very briefly, is that none of the authors I mentioned, and there are more authors I can mention, reference or cite Cedric, nor does Cedric Robinson necessarily cite them, with the exception of Bernard Magubani. And it just never occurred to us, even after Black Marxism came out, that they were all talking about the exact same thing, or that he was using the phrase without attribution in any kind of dishonest way. And in fact, if you want to get technical, Kenyan scholar Rory Kimathi used the term racial capitalism a decade earlier in his 1967 MA thesis at McGill University, titled The Theory of Economic Dualism and Economic Development in East Africa, 1895 to 1960. But again, these are all independent formulations that may or may not overlap. It's like terms like racial regime, for example. It's been used independently by different scholars. Finally, it is worth noting that the proliferation of the term racial capitalism, which has really gone, wild, as they say, in ways that not everyone who writes about it even has a general common definition. But the way in which the term kind of proliferated, it occurs after Neville Alexander's passing and in the last couple of years of Cedric Robinson's life. He died in 2016. Black Marxism came out in 1983, and for 25 years, there was nary a word about racial capitalism here in the US, which makes sense since the term is only used 4 times in his book, and once as a subtitle. So, it's not as if it was a central part of his argument. And this is followed by this kind of dramatic pivot after 2014 toward his use of racial capitalism, which coincides with both new directions in Black studies, as well as a kind of sudden interest in the study of capitalism, that is sort of the new capitalism studies. And this, led to a kind of explosion of scholarship, conferences, symposia, debates, which elevated racial capitalism as an idea to be reckoned with. And yet, and here's kind of like the final sort of lesson here, neither men were trying to build a career on the discovery of racial capitalism. And both paid a price for bucking conventional wisdom and hegemonic ideas. In fact, clearly Neville Alexander paid the greatest price for the positions that he took, becoming a target of the ruling party both before formal apartheid as we know it ended and after. So this leads me to the main point I wish to make, in that Robinson and Alexander actually have much more in common than we might think, especially on the way we think about national liberation as a class question, as the historical context or framework for class struggle. They both recognize national identities not as chimera, but historical. And they both reveal in their work exactly how racial capitalism deploys what Neville Alexander calls racial fundamentalism, that is racism, ethnocentrism, and tribalism, to exploit the working class, to extract surplus, and to arrest national development. So for Robinson, this entailed the incorporation of exploited white workers into the counterfeit nationalism of the US settler state, calling it, in his words, the theft they themselves endured and the voracious expropriation of others they facilitated. The scrap which was their reward was the installation of Black inferiority into their shared national culture. It was a paltry dividend, but it still serves. And it was, for Cedric, it was the misleaders of the Black elite who inherited the colonial state as an instrument of class rule in the name of Pan-Africanism or nationalism. For Alexander, the problem was, again, both the Herrenvolk nationalism of the Afrikaner state and what he called the bogus nationalisms behind Bantustan policy. And I quote, the main purpose of which is to dissipate the force of the class struggle by deflecting it into channels that will nurture the dominant classes. So the Bantustan strategy by the National Party was a means to harness the authentic energies of national liberation or the national liberation movement in order to use them against, and here I'm quoting, against the emergent nation by dividing it into warring and antagonistic groupings graced with the tainted robes of independent nations. Okay, and of course, for both Robinson and Alexander, this is why anti-racism, as opposed to multiracialism, is fundamental rather for genuine revolutionary insurgency, or what Alexander would explicitly identify as class struggle. He envisioned the national liberation movement in South Africa producing a single democratically constituted nation, which, unless counter-revolutionary strategies prevail, will not come into being as long as capitalist relations of production are dominant. Whether or not this single nation does come into being will depend on the extent to which, and I just want to underscore this, this is again, Alexander's words, a working class leadership of the national liberation movement succeeds in determining the political ideology of the revolutionary people. And again, I'm not saying that, you know, we take everything that either Neville Alexander or Cedric Robinson or anyone to take it sort of full blown from its moment of inception, as if somehow it's all applicable in the moment. Comrade Trevor made a very important point about Marxism not being a dogma, that we're always rethinking as conditions change the path forward. But these are really important insights. And this last point, I think, is key of what, you know, if there is still such a thing as national liberation, what does it actually look like? And it was, in theory, the position that I just laid out here, or that Neville Alexander laid out, that is, working class leadership of the national liberation movement succeeds in determining the political ideology of the revolutionary people. It was this position that was also the position of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which also made the case for one nation, a single state, but with the proviso that leadership must be working class, must be the masses, that there be no neoliberal stage toward revolution, that capitalism is not an option for real national liberation. And this is, again, the point that Alexander has made over and over again. The movement had come to see itself, and this is a PFLP, as part of a global anti-imperialist struggle in solidarity with other non-aligned or socialist nations, and fashioned a different model of revolutionary nationalism grounded in class struggle. And this is a really great quote from PFLP militant Raad Abdul Wahad, which I've used in another piece, who's a Palestinian of African descent, born in Haifa, but displaced by the Nakba and forced into a West Bank refugee camp. And he was being interviewed by journalists. And in the interview, he emphasizes that resistance to the occupation, okay, and this is in the 1970s, resistance to the occupation was both a struggle against colonialism and racism. He explained that Black Palestinians were on the front lines of the fight against Israeli forces in Jericho, Haifa, Jerusalem, Gaza. And he talked about the racism they experienced in Israel. And Wahad also acknowledged that he and his fellow fighters in the PFLP follow the Black freedom movement in the US very closely. He said, quote, "Our struggle is the same. We in the PFLP are fighting racism and religious exclusivism. Our aim is to create a free Palestine in which Arabs and Jews can live as equal citizens with regard to rights and duties, form an integral part of the national democratic state." So finally, for Neville Alexander, he really stressed that the racially divided working class in South Africa constitutes the greatest problem or challenge moving forward. But it's not a problem that we can dismiss or evade. And we can't write off a whole section of a working class as so hopelessly racist that it paralyzes our movements. And this is something I see in the United States increasingly now, even about the way we write off the US South, and I'm gonna say something about that in a second, as somehow hopelessly racist and backward, when in fact the South has been the source, the epicenter of our most radical democratic movements in the United States, throughout. And it's precisely because of that threat that the ruling classes in the region of the South, as like the nation itself, have relied on, legal structures, legislatures, policing, state violence, racism, all kinds of things to suppress that radical democratic movement, and disfranchisement being one of them. And yet, at the same time, I think, I worry that we sometimes pretend that all this stuff is just false consciousness, which brings me to the convergence of two things happening in the US, which is what I want to kind of end with. Not quite end, but close. And that is two things happening in the US that we don't always talk about together, but I think they're very, very important. One, Barbara mentioned, that is the struggle to organize Amazon warehouse workers in Bessemer, Alabama, right this minute. As some of you who have been following this struggle know, yesterday, the vote ended for a National Labor Relations Board elections that would determine whether or not Amazon would be required to recognize the union, the retail wholesale department store union, which is organizing the workers. And so we have 5,800 workers, 85% of whom are Black, the majority are female, and they're all voting in this election. But the thing is, if we frame this particular labor struggle in Bessemer, first of all, if we isolate it in Bessemer, that's a mistake. But if we frame it entirely or exclusively as a Black movement and not a class movement, we not only miss the dynamics of the movement, but the potential to organize the entire South. What this represents is a potential wedge to build a regional and ultimately a national revitalized labor movement. And the South includes Latinx workers, immigrant and undocumented workers, and white workers. And white poverty is concentrated in the South. And this is something we got to contend with. There are white workers too who need to be organized, who have often been duped by exactly what Cedric Robinson calls the kind of paltry dividend of a kind of racial ideology that enables them to buy into the kind of counterfeit white nationalism. So if we see it as just a Black movement, then we also miss something else. And that is, and this is a point that I think Barbara implied, and I think knows really, really well, and that is that Jeff Bezos made an amazing effort to buy off that movement in June of 2020, when he gave $10 million to a number of Black and anti-racist organizations, including the NAACP, the National Urban League, others, including what's listed as Black Lives Matter, not the movement for Black Lives. They don't take Amazon money, but and not even Black Lives Matter as a kind of entity, because it's decentralized. But the fact is, somebody in the name took the Bezos money. And one of the things that we have to really pay attention to is the silence of the National Urban League on the Amazon workers in Bessemer. The relative silence, because again, the NAACP is both national and regional and decentralized. The relative silence of the NAACP on the Amazon workers in Bessemer. There's a whole list. If you look at Black celebrities, right? there's really only one major Black celebrity who just stood up for the Amazon workers, and that's Danny Glover, because he always does. He's always there. Like he doesn't pay attention to those. He's in the struggle. So what does this tell us? What this tells us is that racial capitalism operates in such a way in which we have fractions of a ruling class. The ruling class could easily incorporate many people who look like us in the reproduction of racial capitalism. And so that's something to consider. But then one other thing to consider is that the voter suppression laws in Georgia, if we see it only as targeting Black people in a Black struggle, we don't see the class dimensions, because this is a ruling class move. And I'll give you just one very quick example and then conclude. And that is, voter suppression, of course, is historic. It goes back to, it's the history of this country, not just in the South, but especially in the South. And so in Alabama became a right to work state. That is a kind of, let's make it simple, an anti-union state in 1953, when the state legislature passed right to work laws. And it did so as a result of anti-communism and the Cold War and the suppression of the more radical multiracial unions in Alabama. So from 53 on, it was part of the law. In 2016, as a result of voter suppression laws in Alabama, the state legislature succeeded in getting right to work laws enshrined in the state constitution. That was the result of voter suppression against the class. So it wasn't just the denial of Black votes. Of course, we know that's true, but it's more than that. It's against the class. And again, this is consistent with the arguments that both Neville Alexander, Cedric Robinson, in the movements that we're talking about have identified. So just in conclusion, once we acknowledge the combined and uneven development of capitalism, then we have to acknowledge how race and gender and sexuality unevenly structure the character of exploitation. Capitalism is always racial, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, and capitalism extracts surplus value and structures exchange value by assigning differential value to human life and labor, as Andy Clarno says, and that's both historically and in the present. And just to be clear, as Salim Vally pointed out at the opening remarks about Neville Alexander, opposition to racial capitalism, that is to say, anti-racist socialism, is not race reductionism, nor is it the antidote to class reductionism. To insist that capitalism has always operated within a system and ideology that assigns differential value to human life and labor does not mean that race then governs everything and explains all forms of exploitation and oppression. We've got to see these things together. And so while we continue to fight all manner of oppression and exploitation, state violence, devolution of the social wage, the carceral state, gendered violence and femicide, environmental catastrophe, and struggle for housing, for living wages, and so on, I just want to underscore a point that Comrade Trevor made in his opening remarks, that we are fighting for socialism. We are fighting for socialism, a word that has practically vanished from any discussion of Black liberation, at least on this side of the Atlantic, sometimes replaced by abolition, without recognizing that abolition and struggle for socialism ultimately are cut from the same cloth. To be anti-capitalist is one thing, but to be for something, for the transformation of our lives, that's something altogether different. And that's sort of, I think, why we're here. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Comrade Robin. That was a very helpful contextualization of how the concept of racial capitalism has been understood, and yeah, for showing how these superstructures are very intimately linked to each other. So thank you for that. I just want to make a quick announcement that unfortunately we have reached the capacity of this Zoom room, and we know that there were a lot of other people who wanted to join. We were not able to stream on Facebook, but we will make the link to the recording available at a later stage, and we'll ask that everyone here can just share the link to their networks and to anyone else who you know wasn't able to join today. Okay, so let's get on to inputs from the following colleagues. We have Mosa Phadi, we have Andy Clarno, and we have Andile Zulu. Mosa, let's start with you. Mosa completed her PhD at the University of Johannesburg, and she is currently a postdoc fellow at Stellenbosch University. She is also the co-editor of the 2013 book called Class in Soweto. Mosa, it's good to see you again, and you've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm no longer in Stellenbosch, I'm in the Free State now. And I want to start from there in terms of, I'm hoping like I'll make sense because I've been ill. So I'm hoping my thoughts will come as I go. But I want to start from where I am, which is in Bloemfontein at this moment. Mangaung, which the history of Mangaung, for some of you who are not from South Africa, this is the brutal brunt of the settlement. So the Afrikaner took this province as theirs as the Republic was built in various ways. And now it's a city. It's part of the South African 9 cities or metros, as they call them. Mangaung, apart from a city, it's 60 to 65% rural. So basically, it's a city that is built around rural people who've been, for years and generations, have been alienated from their land or removed from Bloemfontein as the center of this place. So I'm starting from that perspective. Why am I starting from that perspective? And I'm gonna start from a space of being of a personal zone. I've been sick for a week in this space. And part of being sick in a space that is so racialized and so classed in that space, and seeking to find a doctor as an emerging scholar was hard. And then comes the question of what happens to the forgotten as the cities outside Johannesburg, in these rural areas in covert, which happens to be majority Black people who are forgotten, who remain, their work still remain as it was during the apartheid, as they come in and out of Bloemfontein to work for majority white people in these areas, still doing the same mundane manual work as before. Still, I mean, like the other time, to the point where the other time in my city, some of the people in the middle of rain, they were actually chopping. Some Afrikaner guy said to them, they might actually sweep the grass, because if they don't sweep that grass, there is no work for that day because it's raining. That's the plight of some of the people who are living in this area are facing. So when you think about it, what I have medical aid or private insurance, health insurance, that I could not find a doctor. What about the plight of the working class and the most marginalized of people in these areas who cannot even access any healthcare in a pandemic, who are dying in these areas that nobody, even the intellectuals, are going to actually study them or actually raise their voices at all. So I'm speaking from that point of view of the thing. And I'm speaking from a point of view of the second thing, around what Robin Kelley has, in one of his articles, talks about, in thinking about racial capitalism is the idea of also thinking about Black Marxism, because when we talk about racial capitalism, the idea of Black Marxism also comes with that. And he says this: Black Marxism is neither Marxist nor anti-Marxism. It is a dialectical critique of Marxism that turns to the long history of Black revolt and to the Black radical intellectuals who also have turned to the history of Black revolt to construct a wholly original theory of revolution and interpretation of the history of modern world. Then it brings a bigger question. Where are the Black intellectuals who are supposed to speak for those who have both forgotten? Right now, as I'm sitting in Bloemfontein, I am teaching students, third years, undergrads, who are living in these remote rural areas who do not have data to actually get access to some of the lectures that I need to do. While I am told at the same time, well, there's such inequality in this country where majority of the students that I'm teaching cannot access digit or data that they need, but I have to stay at home. The university is closed at the same time, while the rest of the working class in this country are working, are out there fighting and actually trying to earn a living. This is the reality of where we find ourselves. So when we think about class and race, these are the contradictions that we find ourselves in, that we have to speak to it. Where is the Black intellectuals to speak truth to the working class, to these children who are actually, majority of them come from working class, are first generations that actually have to go to university in order to actually somehow find to become, as Barbara says, stable working class folks. Where are we? We're sitting at home and actually trying to write our papers outside the revolution, or long history of our Black revolt that is happening on the streets. We have to ask ourselves as intellectuals as well in this process, as we think about this, that actually the university, outside the universities, it's the financial sector that is also closed. Everything else is open. Those are the two components that are closed: higher education and the financial sector. The irony in the story as we speak about racial capitalism that affects our Black children, working class, first generation at universities. Where are we? As the majority still, I go around these rural towns, they're forgotten. Nobody knows their histories. Never mind Johannesburg, Cape Town, where we always do our research and always have people talking about it. Where are we in places where there is no voice, where there is a void, where 1994 never remained? Where are we in a place where the divide is getting worse, where the plight of the working class is getting worse, where the rural people are in abject poverty as we revolt? This is as we grasp ideas around racial capitalism and how race and class intersect, that Neville called for us, that Cendric called for us, and many others before that. These are the questions in this plight that we actually have to start thinking about as intellectuals, but also as we see the working class, Black, being subjugated to these questions. But again, I want to go back to what Deborah says in terms of thinking about hope. And again, it forces us, is that she says at the last end as she closed, it is when we demand the impossible, we become closer to freedom. And this is our job in this. We have to demand the impossible. We have to intellectually force ourselves to go to the impossible in order for freedom to rise in this pride of racial capitalism. So I'm just gonna leave it there.
Thank you, Mosa. Very, very critical input there from you. Okay, next we have Andy Clarno. Andy is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His book titled Neoliberal Apartheid, it traces the shifting dynamics of racial capitalism and settler colonialism in South Africa and Palestine, Israel over the last 27 years. Comrade Andy, you've got 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Terri. It's wonderful to see so many comrades. It's an honor to be part of the conversation with all of you today. I also want to just express solidarity with the mobilizations at Wits and across South Africa. The police murder of Tokosisi and Tumba was a horrible reminder that the university's response to the fees must fall and roads must fall struggles was to militarize South African campuses. We must support ongoing demands for decommodified, decolonized, and demilitarized education. I want to speak briefly about racial capitalism in Palestine and its growing importance to the struggle for liberation. We're witnessing in recent years a resurgence of mobilizations along the lines that Robin just spoke about, demanding a secular democratic state throughout historic Palestine. This builds on a long history in Palestine, as well as on 15 years of struggles for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. In recent months, Haider Eid and Jeff Halper have both spoken to South African audiences about the One Democratic State campaign, which includes efforts to build a secular democratic state grounded in the right of return, with attention to also providing reparations and the redistribution of land and wealth. And that's absolutely critical. The resurgence of these mobilizations is in many ways inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, but is also incorporating a growing recognition of the limitations of transformation in South Africa after apartheid. Ransby Robin recently returned from a trip to South Africa, arguing that, quote, Palestinians need to learn from South Africa's mistakes, right? As well as from the lessons from what's gone well in South Africa. Lana Tatur is arguing that legal equality is not a solution. If Palestinians were to achieve, all Palestinians were to achieve formal legal equality in the state of Israel, currently a section of the Palestinian population does have formal equality as citizens, but that without decolonization, there's no solution. And in a forum hosted by the South African Palestine Solidarity Campaign just last August, Noor Erakat argued that a democratic secular state is inevitable, but it doesn't go far enough, right? Reparations and redistribution are absolutely essential. And I think that this is something that I want to connect to the concept of racial capitalism and the struggles around racial capitalism. In 2019, the Palestinian Youth Movement brought a delegation of 19 young Palestinians on a fact-finding mission to South Africa. It was organized in coordination with the Afro-Middle East Center. I'm gonna drop a link in here for a document that they produced in the wake of this fact-finding delegation. The Palestine Youth Movement has been wrestling with different frameworks for understanding and challenging Israeli rule, including trying to think through the apartheid analogy, frameworks around settler colonialism. And the delegation went to South Africa to learn about the liberation struggle and the transition to democracy there. And the conclusion that you find in that link, they say, quote, the most profound lesson drawn from the South African context for the delegates is that Palestinians must also grapple with racial capitalism, and that if solutions do not allow for a complete redistribution of land, wealth, and power, there will be no true Palestinian liberation. Coming out of that, they also resolved to revive relations of joint struggle and principled revolutionary transnational solidarity. Here in the United States, the Palestine Solidarity Movement is also increasingly embracing a commitment to joint struggle grounded in anti-racism, anti-capitalism, and anti-imperialism. Groups like the Palestine Youth Movement, the US Palestinian Community Network, the Adult Justice Project, Eyewitness Palestine, the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, they're building connections with the Movement for Black Lives, the Red Nation, groups like the Dream Defenders, Black BYP 100, and so many other organizations. The 2014 Ferguson Uprising and the 2016 Standing Rock encampment became key moments in the resurgence of joint struggle frameworks and revolutionary solidarity. All of this is grounded in a recognition that the Black, Indigenous, and Palestinian communities confront distinct yet similar and interconnected forms of racial, colonial, and capitalist domination. And these mobilizations are developing a political critique of white supremacy, settler capitalism, and increasingly racial capitalism. They're working together to bring about the elimination of Israeli apartheid, as well as the global neoliberal apartheid. So it's within this context that I think the radical vision of the South African left could provide a useful contribution for thinking about the racialized class fractions and revolutionary strategy. The Azanian Manifesto, as Salim quoted at the beginning, argues that racial capitalism, quote, holds the people of Azania in bondage for the benefit of a small minority of white capitalists and their allies, the white workers and the reactionary sections of the Black middle class. Racial capitalism in Palestine today is not the same as in South Africa before 1994, in part because neoliberalism has enabled Israeli corporations to reduce their dependence on Palestinian workers. Neoliberal racial capitalism, combined with Zionist settler colonialism, has transformed Palestinians into a truly disposable population. Two of the only jobs that are still available for Palestinians in the West Bank are either building Israeli settlements on land that was confiscated from other Palestinians, or working with the Palestinian security forces, helping the Israeli military suppress resistance to the occupation. Now, Palestinians from Gaza don't even have these opportunities, if you can call them that. Gaza is one of the most extreme versions of engineered disposability on the planet. Yet Palestinians do retain a certain symbolic value as threats. The specter of violence based on a racialized discourse of terrorism has enabled Israeli corporations to emerge at the forefront of a $350 billion global market for advanced security industry, for advanced security equipment, right? By developing and testing high-tech weapons and other devices in the occupied territories and marketing them as such. Meanwhile, Jewish Israelis are being pulled ever further to the extreme right, embracing racist, xenophobic, and patriarchal politics. And many Palestinian elites are deeply compromised by their politics and their dependence on Israel for permits. So these are some of the racialized class relations that Palestinians confront in attempting to formulate a strategy for liberation. The commitment to global and transnational solidarity, joint struggle, and anti-imperialist connections is essential to this. And following Barbara, I want to just briefly lean into that optimism. I think that the growing mobilizations for a secular democratic state, combined with the critique of racial capitalism and the demand for full liberation, is a promising development in the struggle for liberation, return, decolonization, and socialism in Palestine. Yeah, I'll end there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for that. Let's move right on to Andile Zulu. Andile is a political essayist and runs a blog called Born Free Blues. Andile, you can unmute yourself and you've got 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. To begin, after hearing all the remarks and thinking about my own contribution, I thought about how it's possible that a system like racial capitalism has been able to sustain itself for so long, even though it causes so much destruction and so much discord. And I think a part of the problem, of course, are the material restraints to organizing and the power that capital has over the state in the South African context specifically. But another great barrier that seems to exist is ideology. And by ideology, I refer to Althusser, who called it people's imaginary relationships to their real conditions of existence. So that sustained and subliminal messaging that people get from the media, from various institutions, which tells them exactly what their place in the world is and how they should perceive reality. And I remember talking to my kids, I'm a debate coach here in Durban, and I remember we were going over some content, and I asked them if Black and white people had always existed. And most of them said yes. And then as we began to unravel the roots of racism tied to capitalism, they were astounded that this creation had occurred deliberately over time because of material and political reasons. But to reveal that race is a structural creation is to also reveal that there are futures beyond it. And this is the precise moment that we're in right now that's very difficult to get through. So what I want to do is just briefly go over how ideology in South Africa stops us from seeing the true nature of racial capitalism, because it isn't a term that you often come across in popular political discourse. Capitalism itself doesn't even come across in most discussions of unemployment and poverty and inequalities, as if the system doesn't exist at all. So I just going briefly back to history, when the ANC made those crucial compromises and concessions to power, as we all know, of course, they were absorbed into the global neoliberal order. And so a revolution was deferred. And the first huge effect of this was the almost eradication of class consciousness. And through the eradication of class consciousness, race then becomes separated from class, and they become two different phenomena in the popular imagination of most people. And so class then, for example, simply becomes a matter of your wage and your income, the type of job that you do. And race can then be manipulated for a lot of different political interests. So I just want to go through the effects of that essential compromise in terms of its relation to ideology and how people perceive their political realities. And the first big effect has been a historical amnesia amongst many South Africans. So on the one hand, you have your liberals and conservatives who completely deny the historical injustices that have happened, the oppressions that people of color and Black people have been through. And this is a very clever way to avoid the call for redistribution and to avoid the call for justice. And we all know that organizations like AfriForum, for example, and the DA are very well practiced in doing this and ensuring that those aspects of history of Black oppression are continually subverted, made unnecessary, and are made redundant. And so we can maintain ourselves in this neoliberal order as it is. But on the other hand, you have Black elites, specifically in the ANC and the EFF, who then want to erase class struggle, right? And rather make the struggle against apartheid merely a struggle against segregation, against races being separated, and have nothing to do with the crucial questions about how we will reorganize ourselves in terms of our relationships to power and in terms of our relationships to the means of production. So you have that first blockage right there, where we deny history. And so through the denial of history, we have no collective vision of our future, right? If racial capitalism is not acknowledged, we can never come to terms with those crucial questions about how we would like to organize ourselves going forward. But then just briefly, the two other crucial things that begin to happen when race and class are separated, when they're made to be somehow mutually exclusive, is race reductionism. And already I think Robin Kelley and a few other speakers have touched upon this. And you see this quite a lot with the ANC and with the economic freedom fighters. So the post-apartheid struggle is no longer a struggle against racial capitalism or the economic means through which Black people are oppressed. Instead, it solely becomes a struggle against racial inequality and white supremacy. So by that, I mean, the question isn't reconfiguring society along egalitarian terms, radically egalitarian terms. Instead, the aim is to put Black faces in high places, right? So instead, the objective is to ensure that Black people replace their white counterparts in the positions of power. But nonetheless, the economy and the states will remain the same. But the consolation that we get is perhaps because those in those positions are Black, they might therefore fight for the interests of other Black people. But as we know, 26 years later, power does not function in that way. power isn't inclined to the race of the individual. It will function independently regardless. But you also see this fascination with wanting to uplift Black people into the former structures of oppression through the praise for Black enrichment. So for example, Patrice Motsepe is very beloved amongst most people because he was the first, one of South Africa's first Black billionaires, forgetting his complicity in the oppression that goes on in the mining industry. You see the same thing happening with the adoration for Cyril Ramaphosa as, representing the greatest heights that Black people can reach in terms of their positions in the economy. Again, forgetting his complicity in the oppression that has occurred. But just another instance of race reductionism is, in order to avoid questions about class and to avoid questions about material struggle, is how people have fetishized the land debate. The question of how do we redistribute land after 300 years of dispossession? Again, the question is not how do ordinary working class people relate to land in terms of their abilities to survive and sustain themselves, but merely the question that the concern is just simply giving it towards the state, which will now consist of Black people, hopefully under the EFF's policy and under the ANC's policy, and hopefully they will somehow meaningfully impact the lives of ordinary Black people. But again, that isn't the case. And just to conclude, another result of the separation of race from class is race essentialism, where race then becomes the final frontier in terms of our political destiny and in terms of our subjectivity as people. So you often have a tendency amongst racial chauvinists to exclude those that they don't consider as Black and therefore as historically oppressed. So you see this a lot with the EFF's disdain towards South African Indians, often referring to Indians as mini landlords, referring to Indians as inherently racist, referring to Indians as people who are incapable of having solidarity with their Black counterparts. And of course, we know the role that Indian people played throughout the struggle, right? And how much apartheid and colonialism also affected them. But because Blackness has been removed from questions of power and material relationships, you can simply reduce it to this identity, this abstract identity, which signifies those who are oppressed and those who are not oppressed. And I think the worst and most urgent concern for me is the question of xenophobia. And that's probably one of the biggest results of this separation of race from class, is seeing the way in which a lot of Black South Africans, because of how neoliberalism has failed to deliver to them in terms of wealth and security, have now turned their resentment towards those who they don't consider Black like them, those who they consider outsiders, those who they consider other types of Africans. So those have been some of the really dire consequences. But just to conclude, I think what the left needs to do in South Africa particularly is explore alternatives for political education. And we need to try to awaken people's imaginations and our own imaginations to new ways of being. And we can return to the fundamental questions that were diverted in the 1994 transition. We really need to ask ourselves to strive towards that which we're told is impossible. And then we can begin really dealing with what racial capitalism is. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Comrade Andile. Thank you for that. I have shared Andile's piece on the EFF, where he touches on some of the things that he just spoke about. So please do follow that link to read more. And then we've come to what is always the most exciting part, the discussion session. So I'm going to open the floor. Before I do that, I do just want to say that I know many people are a bit annoyed that they couldn't join. We had close to 300 people register, and we did say that we would live stream. But the message that we get is that we're probably being censored in some way because we are using the SABDS Coalition's account. So we will go out of our way to make the recording available. And we'll also ask that people here, when they in this room right now, when we share the recording to the session, that you also please share it widely with your networks. Okay, so let's get to the Q&A or the discussion session. I'm going to open the floor and ask people to give comments or ask questions to the speakers. I'm going to ask that you keep your comments nice and short and to the point so that everybody can have a chance to participate. There are about 97 of us in here at the moment. So let's be considerate of the collective. Okay, so any hands? You can raise your hand. You can put your questions in the Q&A in the chat if you are not interested in having your voice heard. And I'm probably going to ask Francesco to help me manage the hands that get raised. Okay, there we've got one hand. Yeah, please go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm really unsure how to pronounce this name, and I do apologize. The surname is Smith Khan. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Oh, Francesco, can you help me unmute this person, please? Sorry, guys. I'm not sure what's going on. Can I ask the host, Salim or Francesco or Roshan, to please unmute the comrades so that they can give their input, please? Okay, Salim is trying. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, so while we're trying to figure this out, why don't we ask people to just put their questions or their comments in the chat for the meantime until we get this figured out?
I think, Terri, people can unmute themselves. So that didn't happen in that case. I think it was a mistake. The hand went up. But I do know that prior to this meeting, there was a few questions from people. One of them was Professor Daria Rothmeyer, who had a very interesting question. Perhaps if she's still with us, she can pose the question.
I did see her a little while ago. Let's see if she's still here. I'm unsure if she's still in the chat, but Salim, maybe you can go ahead and share that question with us.
Oops, I'm not sure if I remember it. It had to do with worker management. So that was, I'd rather not attempt to mangle Daria's question. And I'll try and get hold of her in the meantime. But I think I'm unable to unmute. How does panel see? There's a question in the chat, Terri.
Yeah, I see this question. The person says, I was unable to unmute. So maybe the tech team can help us with that. And then the question posed is, how does the panel see big tech's role in the future of racial capitalism? I'm going to pose that to any of the speakers who want to answer it. just unmute yourself and go ahead, and then maybe we can get the discussion going that way.
Well, I'll say something. It's not my area of expertise, but you know, I think all of us concerned about the changing nature of 21st century capitalism have to be asking questions about the burgeoning infotech industry on a couple levels. One is the growing sort of surveillance and ability to censor and collaborate in various forms of repression of our movements. But the other is, you know, kind of the nature of the beast and how profit's being made. I was just reading Paul Mason, who I don't agree with on everything, but you know, writing about the growth of the infotech industry as a different kind of capitalist animal, in the sense that, you know, it's very difficult to place value. I mean, capitalism artificially places value. There's a distinction between use value and market value, but it's very difficult to sort of capture the value of information technologies. And, you know, it is a labor light industry. So it is a growing industry that's displaced workers that in a different time, sort of technology would have displaced workers, and workers would have been absorbed in another exploitative industry that emerges. But infotech seems to not be absorbing workers in that way, and so by the nature of the thing. So I think those two I'm wrestling with a lot, and trying to understand what we're dealing with, and not simply have a kind of stiff and rigid formula, as Trevor warns us, you know, for understanding systems of capitalist exploitation. So I think the tech industry raises a lot of new questions that we have to try to figure out. And maybe somebody on the call has indeed figured it out and can answer the question more succinctly.
Yeah, Robin, go ahead. Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah. Now, I would just add, just very briefly, also in the role of big tech in surveillance technologies. I mean, you know, and of course, you all know this, big tech is involved in both prisons, security. You know, you think about something as basic as, in the US at least, the transition from food stamps to EBT, electronic benefits technology transfer, to cards, which actually monitor what people who receive benefits purchase and monitor their movements. And the irony is that the very new technologies that allow us to connect also surveil us. And it has really, you know, and here I'm thinking not just in terms of racial capitalism, but in terms of opposition to racial capitalism and what it means for our movements to be both embedded in these and dependent on these systems, and what they can do in terms of undercutting the work we're trying to do. So there's just one example.
Thank you for that. We've got a few more questions that are in the chat, and I'm just going to read them out. We've got one from Mokong. It says, I like the concept of racial depositism as best explaining the racial capitalism in which South Africa manifested as what came to be known as apartheid capitalism. The concept refers to what is described as white over black, a reality that continues to prevail to this day. And then we've got another comment from Amelia. It says, thank you everyone for these contributions. I'm quite inspired by some of Neville Alexander's writing on the role of education, particularly in the context of schooling in reproducing the ideologies that sustain racial capitalism, as Andile elaborated on. Andile spoke about a vision of political education to awaken our imagination to futures beyond racial capitalism. And my question is, do you think there are possibilities for some of this political education to happen within formal schooling, despite schooling's historical complicity with racial capitalism, both in the US, South Africa, and beyond? And then I've got another question from David that I'm just going to read as well. And David says, the question is for the panel regarding the fees must fall movement in South Africa. How does the fees must fall movement and the constant struggle at the beginning of every academic year relate to racial capitalism? So any takers that want to respond to that question, to those comments? Mosa or Andile, you're welcome to unmute yourself and respond to those. Yeah, Andile, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I'll respond to the question about education in terms of that type of political education. I think it's difficult partly because if you look at what the National Party did with public schooling, they initiated what is called Christian national education. And it was a method of social control to ensure obedience to authority, to ensure that there isn't any critical thinking. And so often a lot of what we call former Model C schools and private schools, especially the elite private schools and the elite former Model C schools, are still trapped within those methods of thinking. And although there are a few schools that are a bit more progressive in terms of their openness to dealing with questions about race and gender and sexuality, generally, I don't think we can have much hope for a new type of political education in the way schools are right now. I think going forward, we would have to restructure and abolish some forms of schooling in the country in order to finally allow kids for their imaginations to open up. And I also think there's just a lot of interests, particularly from the white community and some sectors of the upper Black middle class and the upper, just a lot of wealthier people of color in general. There's a lot of interest in maintaining the way schools are right now. So I think we'd have to just totally renew the school system in order to have the type of political education that children need, because it was built to serve a specific purpose, and it still does to this day. Like whenever we had Fees Must Fall protests at UKZN, for example, often the kids and the students who were unwilling to join were particularly those from former Model C classes and from private schools, because although they may be more educated and more skilled, the capacity to critically think and challenge authority is one that is crushed from a very, very young age. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Andile. I'm going to let Salim come in on the question of education. Thank you, Salim.
Thanks, Terri. I mean, Neville saw himself foremostly as an educationist, and he always saw education as a site of struggle. I mean, he clearly often said that we know that education is used by the ruling class, but it doesn't mean that we can't have counter-hegemonic praxis. And he was very keen on showing demonstrable alternatives in the present. You know, for him, revolution was never an event that happened, but you could build towards that in the embryo of the old. And in the sense, he was very Gramscian in that sense. And I mean, many of his suggestions were very concrete. I mean, the importance of language for him, multilingualism, for him, you know, it was about power, and it was empowering people who were Black and working class, the way languages were dealt with under apartheid and even post-apartheid. He was very upset with the new government and the possibilities that were squandered. You know, he also had very practical, concrete ideas around dealing with spatial apartheid, using schooling. He talked about clustering in a particular way with, you know, very seriously with a number of built environment people, urban developers, etc. So, and he approached people in government. And, you know, they never objected, or they were never willing to engage with him politically, disagreeing with him, but they ignored him. They would give the impression they were interested. So it was very frustrating for him. But I think that he always felt that, you know, education is not the panacea, of course, but at the same time, you can't change society without education. And in terms of political education, he held what was happening in the trade union movement, the independent trade union movement in the 80s, in social movements and post-apartheid, in groups that many of us are familiar with, including people like Trevor Ngwane around the Anti-Privatization Forum, etc., as vitally important, and the development of organic intellectuals. He wrote about this at great length. So education was very important, both in terms of formal education, and he said we should never ever surrender this space. And, you know, after house arrest and after the 76 uprising, the other high point in resistance in South Africa was around the 1980 school boycotts, which coincided with the mobilization against the Koornhof Bulls and the tricameral elections. But there was a committee of 81 of students, and Neville was very involved with them. And they talked about alternative education, using the schools and using progressive lecturers, but bringing people from outside. So it was formal education, creating the space there. It was a site of struggle, but also non-formal and popular education, and the importance of education in social movements, in struggle, the learning moments, the strike, etc., he felt was very important. Thanks, Terri.
Thank you. I see we have a question from, or we have a hand raised, Ntombi. Ntombi, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from Canada, from Toronto. I'm very excited to hear particularly Professor Kelley speak. I've always wanted to interact with him as well as Professor Ramsey on a panel, so I'm happy to be here. Was sent here by my Professor Rosalind Hampton, who helped promote this event. I don't know if she's here or not, but my question has to do with some of the current dynamics that I'm observing in American social movements from Canada, and some I feel have been transposed onto Canadian movements, particularly the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter in particular. And so can both Professor Kelley and Professor Ramsey respond to some of the provocations made by Joy James in her The Architects of Abolition talk around sort of the commodification of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we see at the moment a lot of pushback against the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, for example, as well as her provocations around contemporary abolitionism as a movement, as well as sort of some of the ideological fissures and tensions between people and the lack of ideological clarity as a whole in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement and the abolitionist movement. So I'd love to get your take on those provocations made by Professor James as well as others.
Thank you,
Barbara has to go first.
Okay, I'm going to ask Robin and Barbara to answer the question as nice and succinctly as you can. We still do have closing remarks from Comrade Enver that we need to get in. And then I'm going to ask Comrade Mosa to respond to the Fees Fall question, if you would like, please. Okay, so Comrade Barbara, go ahead, please.
Nice
yeah,
answer.
go ahead.
I'm just kidding. I mean, it's a complicated question, and so it's difficult to answer it quickly. yes, there, I think one of the things that I have said about the movement, and I think is a strength, is that at the very outset in sort of Ella Baker's tradition, people attempted to build movement organizations that were not leader-centered, but were group-centered. That said, I think the culture being what it is, we have seen the emergence of celebrity, and we have seen with the large-scale protests, donors and foundations throwing money at movement organizations and throwing money at websites, and they don't even know who's running it. So these are a lot of problems, and there are many deep struggles and soul-searching sessions and debates going on within movement spaces around this question. As I said, the Black Lives Matter Global Network is an entity unto itself, and there's been very specific critiques and conversations, and I think there are people of good faith trying to work it out. I do think it's complicated, and I do think not only were mistakes made by people inside the movement, but I just think we haven't handled issues of transparency and accountability very well. I'm just trying to be succinct and discreet. I don't think Joy James has raised a number of criticisms, both by movement and particularly about Angela Davis in different writings, which I don't think are particularly helpful or accurate. So that is a quick summary on that front, but I'm happy to talk more offline.
Okay, great. Can I, Robin, would you like to respond to that quickly? Okay.
No, I think it's all done.
Okay, great. Daria, I see your hand is up, but before I go to you, I just want to ask Mosa to respond to David's question about fees must fall. Please, Mosa.
I think one of the key things this year, I'm speaking from the context that what happened in the Free State and what I've been hearing, what's happening at VETS. But one of the things that we have to reckon with in terms of understanding the daily manifestation of racial capitalism, especially in the South African context, and Neville spoke about this, the role of the Black elite that is embedded in the whole structural system of it. Also because I am reading on Du Bois and trying to find Du Bois in South Africa. One of the premise of Du Bois's ideas also he didn't use the word racial capitalism, but the aim of his analysis was thinking that capitalism, the cornerstone of capitalism is racism. That was at the very heart of Du Bois's ideas. And I think in many ways, if we have to actually put this idea in a broad sense of racial capitalism, also we have to go a little bit further in one level as a conversation. I think it's something that we have to think about. But speaking about the fees must fall, one of the things that is actually we are in crisis. We have failed the ANC or the Black elite enmeshed in white capitalist with the racial component of it, is that they don't know where to go. What we've been told by the Minister of Education is that the ANC, I'm assuming everybody knows what the ANC, the governing party of South Africa, that actually they've done very well in terms of incorporating the working class children into higher education compared to its predecessors. That's what the argument is. But in a world where now there is both ideological bankruptcy and capitalism in itself is in crisis and declining, the elite who go by saying that and still use this trumpet of national liberation as a rhetoric in order to keep the Black voters coming back, is no longer holding. So, and the contradictions finds itself in higher education. in many spaces, and higher education also being a site of struggle. The fiscus is in crisis, huge problems in terms of actually that they don't know what to do. They cannot actually, what this fees must fall has shown even before 2015 and now, is that they cannot incorporate the working class into the system anymore. That's what they say. So what do we do now with the latest thing is actually oppress and suppress as much protest, particularly the working class kids who want to come to higher education, because this is the dream of what becoming middle class is. They've been suppressed. I mean, I was at the protest at the Free State. There were more police than the students protesting. You know what I mean? They were outside. They were like 500 police people and like 100 students. That's how bad it was this year in terms of that. And 17 students were arrested for nothing and actually standing and protesting that they want actually access to education. So the whole system has been, it's in tatters, and they don't know how to deal with the poor and the working class who are seeking for something better, because that's what education has been done. It's been told to be in one level. In one level, it is the material reality. Some people have moved upwards because of education, and we have to think about that. But also, I think what happened this year compared to the fees must fall. So I'll wrap up as quickly as I can. Compared to the fees must fall, the narrative has changed. And I think it's an ideological thing also as we fight for the struggle. That the narrative of 2015 was the fees must fall. The narrative now the students are saying is that we need to be included in NAFSAs. And I think we have to think about, as we struggle and as we concede in this power, which is capitalism and elite and so on that happens there, that actually what is our demand as well as the working class, and what are the contradictions that we're actually throwing out there? That is also part important. And of course, there are trial and errors, but I think there is some of the students, especially the NAFSA students, I can't go into NAFSAs, I think someone can explain it in nicer English than I do, is that these represents the working class kids, the poorest of the poor to be included. And I think also we have to, the narrative of fees must fall, not to be included in NAFSAs has to come back in our politics as we demand for free and broader higher education. And I think those are also some of the contradictions in the struggle for students that has happened this year as well, including as well the divisions that actually has happened between, I've heard elsewhere, but also it played out in different ways in the Free State between the EFF dimension and the SASCO dimension, and those divisions and what it actually mean in terms of also the politics as we organize, especially the students as they organize. But I think at the heart of it, what happened as the response when these things were happening is that in the Free State, the academic week was suspended. The staff went crazy, right? The academic staff were saying also we need to be protective. If the students can do this because we're in crisis, we also need to be protected. So there is also divisions between the academic role and also the student, in divisions as well within the student movement as well. We have to think about carefully as we fight for the struggle for this as well. But the elite and so on have failed us.
Thank you, Mosa. Daria, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you. And if you can keep it nice and short, we do want to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, I'll keep it very short. I just want to shout out to Salim, Trevor, Enver, and others with whom I worked earlier. My name is Daria Roithmeyer. I'm a Latina law professor at USC, who is part of a formation in a group of legal scholars called Law and Political Economy who are working on racial capitalism. And as part of a project that I'm working on, a book called Racism Pays, I've been in conversation with Philip Dexter and others from South Africa who are telling me about essentially what amounts to a worker takeover as part of an economic recovery project to repair the economy from pandemic-related damages. And a worker takeover might include seed money for worker-created businesses to rebuild, and maybe more interestingly and more radically for me, using unclaimed pensions to buy up a lot of employer-owned stock to put into a trust for workers with trustees directed to exercise working minority shareholder control to protect workers under threat of a veto. So it's a fighting capitalism with capital sort of project. And I'm wondering if the idea is to use capitalism to beat the capitalists at their own game in this radical way, not your grandmother's Aesop, right? What people think of that, using the levers of power that elites have been using for years, the power of numerosity for workers. Here in the States, the shareholder activism movement has a long history, but I'd be really eager to hear from both South Africans and Americans about this sort of worker engineered takeover approach strategically.
Thank you for that question. Comrade Trevor, are you interested in answering that question at all?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well, remember Malcolm X said by any means necessary. However, every tactic, maneuver, comes with certain costs and certain risks. So I think if that can be managed, but I think as long as we set our goal firmly, explicitly and openly as the overthrow of capitalism, then whatever we do, even if not exactly, it should align with that goal. So I'm not saying that, if you can create contradictions, if you can keep the capitalist class and the functionaries running around in rings, because it is like Comrade Mosa says, the capitalist class hasn't got solutions for their crisis or the crisis of the system, nor are they in agreement, how to manage the crisis. So they are fighting over that. So I think at a time like that, it becomes even much more important, to point to what I can call the ultimate goal, so that maybe we move, closer to that. But, in the spirit of Malcolm X, I'm not going to dismiss, without proper study and without looking at the context, specific tactics and strategies, to shorten that path to the overthrow of the system of the bourgeoisie.
I think Robin wants to come in as a final answer to that question. You're muted, Robin.
There, just very quickly, very quickly, because it's a great question, and Trevor gave I think a great answer, and I would add to that two things very quickly, and it speaks to what Trevor was saying. This is a dialectical dynamic process, and so in the U.S., of course, they're using this language of reformist reforms versus reforms that reproduce the system, but in some ways, there's so many worker initiatives, whether it's buying companies and building cooperatives, whether it's, there's all kinds of worker initiatives, even the initiative of creating, which are not so much worker initiatives, but much community initiatives by working class people to create community gardens, for example. But there's a way in which capital rolls up on them and figures out ways to appropriate, displace, own, control, and undermine. And so even the union itself as a structure, there's ways in which there's some unions that are captured by capital in ways that other unions are not fully, completely. So yes, in the end, people need to live and survive. And just in terms of day-to-day survival, and I saw something in the chat was very, very important observation that when working people are in stronger positions of what Barbara talked about as stable, the stable working classes often are the ones that have various resources and means and even a potential vision to move forward and to basically stand up to capital's machinations in a way that the most immiserated have trouble. That's not saying it's not possible, but building alliances across the board and building and developing strategies that both move people forward, help them survive, and bring down the system are important, because that bringing down the system is not evolutionary. It's not through, incremental change, but through this constant struggle and recognition, as Trevor says, to remember what the long-term objective is, and that is a new society without capitalism.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your comments. Thank you to the speakers for your responses to those questions. We've come to the end of our program, so I'm going to ask Comrade Enver to say a short set of closing remarks for us. Comrade Enver, if you can unmute yourself, turn your video on and do your thing, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Terry. If you don't mind, I won't turn it, because I have a very unstable network here, and I have found in the past that when I do that, it just cuts off completely.
That's okay,
so,
thank you.
If you don't mind, and I'm sorry about that. I wasn't very sure whether my closing remarks were to thank everybody and to try and point to some of the most important issues which were raised by the wonderful set of speakers we had, or whether I'm able to say a few things, substantive things about Neville Alexander's writing on racial capitalism. So I'm going to do a mixture of both. The first part I do want to say is thank you very much to Barbara and Robin and Mosa and Andile and Andy for their very thoughtful and carefully prepared presentations. I think it's a real tribute to the annual Neville Alexander Conference, which we have, that we were able to find such important voices to reflect with us on the contributions of this great revolutionary. And of course, if I'm meant to be saying thank you, then I must also say thanks very much to Salim and to Trevor. Trevor, thank you very much for joining CERT and Kawe in this, and may this collaboration grow greatly from now on. And thanks very much to you, Terri, for facilitating this whole discussion so well. So I hope that's adequate. I hope, I don't think there's anybody who really wants long, well, what's the word, praise singing amongst us critical beings, because that's not in the spirit, certainly not in the spirit of Neville and his work. A few things about Neville's work, about Neville's writing on this precise issue. It struck me in reading a lot of Neville's work. Salim and I have been reading this stuff for a long time, that although we are talking about racial capitalism, Neville really never wrote a substantive piece directly on that question. And it's not surprising that he didn't do that specifically. That's because if you're Black and working class, or worked in working class organizations in Southern Africa, the impact on the lives of Black workers of both racism and class exploitation were self-evident. So the coincidence of the convergence of issues of race and class, I regret, to be quite frank, that our entry into the debate around patriarchy took a somewhat back seat, and it took some time before we began integrating issues of patriarchy and even the environmental questions into our analytical framework. But it's hardly surprising that for anybody who's worked and lived in this part of the world that race and capitalism are inseparable analytical categories. So Neville dealt with this question, however, by reference to his attempt to explain the national question to all of us. Well, as you know, as Salim said, he started thinking about this issue while he was in Robben Island. And his approach is motivated, as he himself said, it was motivated by the desire to unify the national liberation movement. In other words, the various movements within the national liberation movement. People who know the history of Neville and his life know how often his detractors attempted to call him sectarian. Well, it's ridiculous because, he was forever trying to, he was absolutely critical of those he found wanting, but he was forever trying to bring people together. And he says this, he did this by what he uses the phrase, I think, fomenting a discussion on the basis of about the national question, seeking national unity, but more importantly on the political and strategic implications of what this meant in the struggle against apartheid. And he does this by firstly analyzing for us the reactionary nationalisms which conflicted with the interests of the working class. He's quite explicit throughout his writings. The interests of the working class are absolutely predominant. And he talks about having to counteract the strategies, I think he used the word nefarious strategies, which are associated with these reactionary nationalisms. And I'll tell you why that's a very important phraseology, because that's exactly what we face with today. It hasn't gone away. And he predicted that this would be a central question for the liberation struggle. And he talks about that at the time, social relations were constituted as race relations, when in fact, and the purpose of that was really to obfuscate the real basis of economic inequality and the real ideological forms in which class oppression was expressed at the time. So he, of course, reminds academic sociologists, bourgeois sociology, that it's necessary to clarify, as it were, to demystify concepts like race and nation, nationalism, ethnic group. He talks about how Mr. Mandela, in his discussions with him at Robben Island, saw the country simply as being made up of a dominant African nation and a set of minority nations. And I'm afraid that from a historical perspective, that ideological position has remained absolutely dominant to this day. So the point I was making is that above all, Neville was a revolutionary activist, and his examination of this race and class question was very much a question which arose from the problematic of political mobilization, which dealt simultaneously with egregious and rampant racism and the exploitative relations over the laboring classes and their social reproduction. For him, mobilization was the pivotal issue, and that's why he talks about very many areas through which such mobilization could be taken forward. For instance, through his considerable body of writings on the language questions, in which he tries to show how if you abandon the hegemonic discourses of language, you begin to bring more and more people behind the concept of a single nation. The same about his writings in relation to culture, in relation to education, and of course, very much as Robin reminds us about the organizational question, in which for him, the leadership of the working class was preeminent. So that's what I think Neville left to us, and in many ways, that entire discourse, that entire analytical the exercise which he asked us to understand has been relegated to a place from which we absolutely must continue to revive it and insist on its continued validity. Because today, in post-apartheid South Africa, and about which he made many predictions, you know, an ordinary country talks about that, how not very different South Africa is in the post-94 period from any other capitalist state. What we are left with is a set of dominant ideas, none of which, or for all of which, Neville's analysis remains critical. We have I think one can categorize them in three categories. There may be others, but I think in broad terms, the dominant ideologies that continue to obfuscate all of the nation is the liberal view. In the pre-apartheid period, that liberal view was stated as the conflict, as the absence of conflict, or that the idea that racism was dysfunctional to capitalism. That was the position advanced by the liberals of the day. Today, that has been transmuted into a kind of constitutionalist, a liberal constitutionalist discourse, which attempts to privilege the idea of the defense of the Constitution as having primacy, as being absolutely fundamental for the constitution of this, and Neville was very unhappy about the concept of a rainbow nation. The second, I think, confusing discourse, confusing set of ideas are, of course, around the National Democratic Revolution, and they are absolutely very much the same as what Neville set out in great detail, the bogus nationalism, the bogus democracy, and the bogus revolution of the National Democratic Revolution, which in fact is these days nothing more than a justification for the rampant bourgeois class. And the third and very troublesome element of what I think is a fairly dominant ideology in South Africa is the emergence of a kind of neo-fascist discourse, which was it Andile, I think, who began to put his finger on it. I think it is this neo-fascist discourse is hardly surprising, given how global neoliberalism and its creed has caused considerable disarray all over the world. And we are, as we all know, we are witnessing the emergence of fascist and neo-fascist regimes all over the world, in countries like, well, you had it in the US, Brazil, India, Hungary, elements of it in, of course, the Middle East monarchies can be characterized as such, so too with Israel and several other places. So I think we are missing an important development in global, which is a consequence of global neoliberalism. I think the failure of global neoliberalism is a is a generative cause of what we are beginning to see globally. I mean, Biden might have won the election, but there are still 75 million or so people who continue to support the extreme right-wing neocon ideology of Trumpism. So that for me constitutes a potentially strong and emergent sort of ideology, even in South Africa. And I'm afraid I don't think we're paying careful enough attention to it. The last point I want to make really is that the answer to these things is continued support for the mobilization of working class struggles, of social movements, of student struggles, the support for the emergence, for the really very, very important emergence of new forms of social organization, which prefigure a completely alternative set of social relations based on democratic participation, on new approaches to organizing livelihoods and democracy. I think that's where our energies must be concentrated even more than we are presently doing. And I fear that part of our problem is the abiding sectarianism of old forms of political organization. I think we have to rethink the politics of organization also. We have to rethink the politics of the left. There is still a considerable body of left thinking in South Africa and globally. But I think it's not possible to do that in a single nation state. I think that, you know, our regular pronouncements about internationalism must be given much more substance. I think they remain largely symbolic at the moment and don't really have, I don't think it's possible to overthrow capitalism in a single country. Inevitably, single countries which are weak capitalist states appear to be inverted commas, resolving the contradictions in them by turning to the fascist right. And that, I'm afraid, is a real possibility in many, many, many countries against the failures of global neoliberalisms, the impact of it on especially the great majority of the working classes and socially marginalized population. So I'm extremely pleased that Salim and Trevor, we've started on this road of getting together beyond our own boundaries, and we've now, what we need to do is to solidify these relationships, to bring more people into the vast networks that we already have, but in much more productive and solidaristic ways, so that we can together rethink how exactly this barbaric, this world that's driving us into barbarism can be rescued from going over the precipice. Thanks very much, Terri.
Thank you so much, Enver. Thank you. That was very, very important inputs from you. So thank you everyone for joining us. This was a very, very fruitful session. And in saying goodbye, Salim has asked that we all turn our cameras on and unmute ourselves and just shout goodbye or shout anything that you want to. Let's say goodbye in a lekker way.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye so much.
Bye, everybody. Bye, and thank you very much. Thanks for everything.
Bye-bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Good drink.
Terri, Salim, Trevor.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Cool. Sophia, Sophie, Esther.
Michael's here as well.
Hello.
Yes, hi. Sam, Only Aziz is hiding.
Trevor.
Okay, bye everybody. Thanks
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Aziz.